Moderator of panel 2 to discuss the way forward towards more inclusive partnerships. I'd like to introduce the moderator of this panel, Ms. Larysa Belskaya, who is the head of the General Department for Multilateral Diplomacy of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Belarus. She joined the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Belarus in 1994, and her diplomatic career included holding several management positions in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and also she served in various capacities in the diplomatic missions abroad, including as the first secretary in the Embassy of Belarus to the United Nations, Council of the Permanent Mission of Belarus to the UN, and in this role, she focused on different aspects of international relations in socio-economic development, gender equality, and family policies, human rights, and human trafficking. She was elected to the post of Vice Chair of the UN Commission for Social Development at the 51st and 52nd sessions of the Commission. And just we're very thankful. I'd like to take this opportunity. We're very thankful to numerous initiatives of Belarus in the fight against trafficking in human beings, and the initiative on the establishment of the group of friends against trafficking in persons. Larysa, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and good morning, colleagues, Your Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, allow me to extend my sincere appreciation to Her Excellency Madina Jarbusinova, OSCE Special Representative and Coordinator for Combating Trafficking in Persons, for steering this meeting and keeping the issue of partnership against human trafficking in the OSCE region alive. The issue of forging the new partnership and enhancing existing ones is very, very topical, and in particular in the terms of implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Developments, where Goal 17, Revitalize the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development, speaks for itself. Belarus would like to reiterate her well-known stance on this point. If you want to succeed, you need to harness the efforts of all stakeholders. The classical triangle of partnership comprising governments, civil society, and international organizations is a solid basis in this work. At the same time, we should expand the constellation of new emerging partners, such crucial as private sector, mass media, academia, youth, including youth-led organizations. All of them should not be left behind. And so, dear colleagues, allow me to introduce the first speaker of the panel, Mr. Angel Tilvar, who is a member of the Romanian Parliament and coordinator of the Parliamentary Group for Fight Against Human Trafficking. Since 2016, he has been deputy head of the Parliamentary Committee for Education, Science, Youth and Sport, and on European Affairs. He has also been deputy head of Committee for Defense, Public Order and the National Security, and on European Affairs of the Chamber of Deputies of the Romanian Parliament. From 2014 to 2015, Mr. Tilvar served as the Minister Delegate for Romanian abroad and as Rapporteur for the Defense and Security Committee of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, as well as the Vice President of the Socialist Group of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. He has a degree in political science and degree in foreign policy and diplomacy from the Romanian diplomacy. Mr. Tilvar will discuss how the legislative branch should be engaged more in the fight against trafficking in human beings. Parliaments are adopting laws and regulations on human trafficking, but they could also be engaged in other activities, such as awareness raising, monitoring, and organizing public hearing of NGOs, survivors, academia, etc. Mr. Tilvar, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very, very much. Dear Chair, distinguished guests, dear colleagues, it is a high pleasure for me to speak in this frame, and I would like to appreciate the efforts made by the organizers for providing all conditions for having a successful conference here in Vienna. My intervention will be based on presenting in front of you, dear colleagues, some aspects dealing with the way the Romanian institutions work together in finding the best solutions for fighting against human trafficking. On one hand, on the other hand, as being the representative of a parliament and coming from a country that has a special group dedicated to the issue we discussed today, I'll try to share a few impressions and a few glimpses of experience of what we are doing, and maybe you'll find them useful for your activity in working with the Parliament or serving in the Parliament, on one hand. On the other hand, I would like to stress the idea and to invite you to meditate on the opportunity of having this kind of discussion within the Parliamentary Assembly of OSCE, because I think that the Parliament may be a pillar and a stakeholder that is important in our fight. Combating trafficking in human beings continues to be a political priority for Romania. And I'll start by saying that the Romanian authorities have made significant efforts to prevent and fight against trafficking in human beings. Romania values the importance of partnerships in the area of preventing and fighting trafficking and will continue to work with all international stakeholders towards this goal. Thus, Romania is an active partner working with organizations such as Europol, Interpol, Eurojust, Frontex, and the SELECT, which is the Southeast European Law Enforcement Center. The relevant legal framework has been set in accordance with the highest international standards in the field. Romania is party to all major international legal instruments addressing trafficking in persons. We have also invested efforts into updating the national legislative framework in this field. The civil society also plays an important role for supplementing, where needed, the governmental efforts. And I want to stress the idea that us as parliamentarians put great stress on working with NGOs. In our view, the cooperation with the civil society in the area of assistance, reporting and repatriation of victims of the trafficking of persons is a necessary condition for supporting the services focused on the superior interest of victims. Romania implements the national identification and referral mechanism for the victims of THB and is part of transnational referral mechanism in the Southeast Europe. It has helped improve data collection system, and the information achieved is used in elaborating new policies and adapting ongoing activities to the new trends and problems identified. Specialized anti-THB training on identifying and assisting victims of trafficking and investigating and prosecuting THB cases is constantly provided to government officials with attributions in combating THB, such as police officers, investigators, prosecutors, diplomats, etc. The National Agency Against Trafficking in Persons runs, among other, awareness-raising campaigns at national level and abroad, covering a wide range of forms of trafficking and targeting both the general public as well as vulnerable groups. The messages promoted through the awareness-raising campaigns are related to the risks and implications associated to THB and tailored to the specific of the local communities and the target groups, for example, vulnerable categories, the public at large, persons who come in contact with THB victims or potential victims, etc. Usually, the campaigns are implemented in cooperation with the local authorities, institutions involved in preventing and combating THB, NGOs, and aim to strengthen the aspect of prevention and to change the negative social attitudes towards victims of trafficking. Dear colleagues, dear participants, the Romanian authorities are equally focused on the transnational dimension of trafficking in human beings, which requires a close cooperation between the Romanian and foreign authorities through a multilayer approach, from prevention to identifying presumed victims, facilitating their safe run to the country of origin and prosecuting perpetrators. On the 15th of February 2017, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the National Agency Against Trafficking in Persons signed a partnership agreement. And I want to stress the influence and the importance of working with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as I want to mention that we have a mobility new diaspora that counts more than 3 million persons. So imagine the amplitude of the phenomenon and the attention we have to pay in dealing with all the situations that may affect the Romanian citizens living abroad. As a result of the project, reducing the human trafficking amplitude through better information of citizens is currently being implemented with the aim to increase awareness of the general population and of the persons at risk on the implications of trafficking in human beings. The Romanian Ministry of Foreign Affairs has participated, along with the National Agency Against Trafficking, in various NGOs, in public and joint activities in order to share its experience and expertise and for a better understanding of the competences of the Romanian authorities involved in preventing and combating THB. For example, in 2017, representatives of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs Consular Department participated in the activities conducted during the implementation of the National Awareness Campaign named Keep Being Informed in Your Country, Be Safe Abroad. The campaign, initiated by the Ministry of the Romanians Abroad, was carried out in the counties of Botoșani, Suceava and Neamț, which, by the way, are counties from which a lot of victims come, with the aim of informing, preventing and combating the risk factors that may occur for the Romanian citizens residing abroad, simultaneously with supporting the integration process of Romanian citizens in the countries where they live, study or work, as well as their social insertion and reintegration with the decision to return to Romania. Additionally, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, through the diplomatic missions and consular offices, grants general consular assistance to the Romanian citizens, including those presumed victims of THB. According to the Romanian legal framework, consular assistance consists of issuing, free of charge, emergency travel documents for returning to the country of origin, providing possibilities of returning to Romania, offering in collaboration with local authorities, accommodation, food and other facilities, if possible, providing with useful information on accommodation centers, contact points and details of NGOs. The prompt notification of the competent local authorities in the state of residence by the Romanian diplomatic and consular offices refers to requesting urgent investigation of presumed offences related to THB or other forms of abusive treatment by the local employers in relation to the Romanian citizens, the punishment of the offenders, as well as the restoration and the observance of the human rights and fundamental freedoms of the victims, for example, social rights, freedom of movement, etc., and, where appropriate, their safe repatriation. The other pillar I wanted to focus upon during my presentation refers to the way the Parliament involved. And I'll try to be, if I have time...
yes, please.
Yes, thank you. I want to start from year 2009, when within the European Affairs Committee we decided to make the all-party group of fighting against human trafficking. It was quite an easy task at the very beginning, because there were a lot of colleagues from all the parties who wanted to be part of this group and who offered themselves to work within this group. The next thing we did was to contact the NGOs and the significant NGOs and partners from either other parliaments or from Romania. One of our first colleague, let's call it, came from UK. I refer to Anthony Steen, who was a very, very distinguished and experienced parliamentarian, and who led the all-party group of fighting against human trafficking at that moment. Now he has the Fighting Against Human Trafficking Foundation in UK. We decided to establish a partnership with them, and we started to work together. And we became very, very soon, we became part of the network, and we also focused our attention upon working in the national borders. So at the level of the Parliament, within the Committee for European Affairs, this group produces, or has been producing since then, a report annually, an annual report, that is preceded by hearings within the Parliament. Because we started from the assertion, from the idea that the parliamentarians have a tribune, the parliamentarians exert the control upon the executive, they are in full communication with the voters from their constituency, and the fact that we offered an all-party approach to this group was a very inspired decision, because you know that parliaments used to transform in politics almost everything. In this case, we have a sort of consensus that help us work together no matter what party we represent in the legislative form. I started my presentation saying that we produce legislation. This is what we are expected to do. But I also told you that the legislation we produce was in accordance with the international norms and with international discussions, because, as I mentioned previously, we approach the phenomenon from a transnational perspective. I told you that we organize hearings. We organize hearings in which we invite the main stakeholders that deal with the phenomenon in our country. And I'm referring to the Ministry of Justice, to the special institutions dedicated to fighting against human trafficking, NGOs, representatives of Ministry of Interior, of the police, of organized crime, of witness protection institutions, of Ministry of Foreign Affairs, because I told you and I tried to express in my presentation the idea of working with a huge number of Romanians living abroad who sometimes are victims either of modern slavery or other forms of human trafficking. So during these hearings, we take all the relevant info and turn them into a report that we present first within the committee, then within the plenary session of the Chamber of Deputies and of the Senate of Romania. And this report, which is, as far as I know, the only report that is produced by a parliament in Europe, is useful for all the institutions because according to which we have the main basic lines we have to follow. So I invite and we offer to help and discuss with all the colleagues that are willing to do the same thing. And I think that the importance of involving the Parliament in such an activity is more than useful. I'll try to stop here, not before thanking Madina for the wonderful and useful discussion we have some time ago in Romania. And I think this is the reason I'm here, and thank you. And thank you, everything, dear colleagues, for the fact that early in the morning you wanted to listen to my words and maybe share some of my ideas. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Tilvar, for your interesting presentation. And I do believe that examples which you provided during your presentation with regard to the interparliamentarian cooperation and how the Romanian Parliament, representatives of different parties, work with the civil society, organizing hearing and other parliamentarian activities are very valuable and very interesting for participants of the conference today. And I do believe that many countries will consider your experience very useful for implementation in the activity of the parliament, national parliaments, as well as implementation or use your experience in the activity connected to countering human trafficking and awareness raising at the national level. I thank you. Our next speaker is Ms. Vineta Polatside, Senior Advisor and Head of the Task Force Against Trafficking in Human Beings at the Council of the Baltic Sea States. She has been working in the field of human trafficking for 50 years. Previously, she has worked with human trafficking issues at the International Organizations for Migration, and she is also a co-founder of the main anti-trafficking NGO shelter, Safe House, in Latvia. Ms. Polatside, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, the Council of the Baltic Sea States was created to provide a platform for regional cooperation in the Baltic Sea region. It works through expert groups and through projects. A task force against trafficking in human beings, which I represent, is a dedicated expert group that is mandated to counteract human trafficking in all its forms. The focus of the task force has always been in strengthening multidisciplinary cooperation with various national, international, and also local actors. Today, I specifically want to present our work with local actors, with municipalities. Trafficking, of course, is a cross-border crime of global nature, but it also has very specific and concrete implications for local communities. Vulnerable people are exploited in our neighborhoods, people are approached and recruited in our streets, and also assistance to victims are not provided in a global space, but in a very concrete space. So naturally, to address these problems, local responses are extremely important. So since 2014, the task force is implementing an initiative called STROM, strengthening the role of municipalities in the work against human trafficking. And we are grateful to the Nordic Council of Ministers and to the Swedish Institute for financial support to this initiative. Why municipalities? Isn't it a responsibility of state to combat human trafficking? Human trafficking, of course, is relevant for both big cities and also small towns and rural areas. However, cases of human trafficking are detected less frequently in small towns. and not because there are less victims. Quite opposite. Often people in small towns and rural areas are even more vulnerable to trafficking, and not just because of maybe higher unemployment or poor economic situation, but also because traffickers realize more and more that it's easier to recruit people and also to exploit them in smaller towns, because the chance to be caught is smaller than in big cities where there are specialized police units, specialized agencies and non-governmental organizations. Therefore, it's so important to train local actors to identify victims of human trafficking and to detect situations of exploitation. There is also significant potential for improving municipalities' role in prevention activities and in assisting victims, especially those victims who have a long-term assistance needs. I would like to point out 5 main challenges and limitations for municipalities we identified in the Baltic Sea region. And I need to start with the obvious one because it is the most prominent one: lack of cooperation at various levels. Local actors express that they feel often isolated in their work and in their attempts to fight human trafficking at the local level. The cooperation with municipality relies largely on active individuals and on whether key persons acknowledge the relevance of this topic. It's better than nothing, but it's not really, this approach is not really sustainable. There is also lack of cooperation within municipality among various local actors. There are no local referral mechanisms, or they are not functional, and there is a lack of unified front. This has been mentioned as a challenge in many countries. Another issue is the mandate. Roles of municipalities in several countries are not defined by the legislation. Lack of regular training in the local level, particularly on identification of victims of new forms of human trafficking and on long-term assistance needs. Pre-existing victim-blaming attitudes hamper identification, which is often related to a lack of awareness on this problem. And last but not least, lack of sufficient funding is an issue basically in all countries. To sum up, the role, task and capacity of municipalities to combat human trafficking vary greatly and need improvement. What actions have been taken so far to address these challenges? So the first step was to develop guidelines for municipalities. These guidelines focus on the main critical issues identified by local actors: how to map the local trafficking situation, where to look, how to identify victims to assist, and also how to strengthen prevention measures. These guidelines are available in 10 national languages, and they are used not only in the Baltic Sea region, but have been adapted also to the countries of Danube region. These guidelines were piloted in 8 municipalities in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Northwest Russia. Local groups or local task forces were created to develop local cooperation mechanisms. And these cooperation mechanisms are also relevant for further dissemination in other municipalities. For example, in Lithuania, the Ministry of Interior currently is carrying out consultations to encourage all the municipalities to adopt these local cooperation mechanisms. Extensive training for local actors and diverse prevention activities were organized in participating countries, and this component proved to be the most crucial and the most needed one, because there is hardly any awareness-raising activities organized at the local level in our member states, and it shows that prevention is not really a priority for governments and also for local actors. In conclusion, I would like to share a few lessons learned from this initiative. Firstly, it's important to minimize isolation of used strategies and methods to fight human trafficking at the local level, and more opportunities should be provided to both building networks and highlighting local cooperation and local initiatives. Local actors pointed out that there are hardly any international or national events focusing on and highlighting the work at the local level. And this international networking component was highly appreciated by the participants. And I would like to thank OSCE for highlighting this issue here today. Developed local referral mechanisms should be integrated in the national and transnational referral mechanisms to ensure sustainability. The more official these mechanisms are, the more clearly defined is the role of municipalities. For example, a few municipalities in our region have adopted legal acts introducing these local models and setting up working groups with allocated municipal funding. And we are promoting this approach in our member states. We also saw the commitment of representatives at the higher decision-making level should be ensured to boost anti-trafficking work. Efforts to address victim-blaming attitudes should be taken into account when developing future initiatives at the local level. And the awareness raising and training is a key. This issue, as a particularly problematic one, was highlighted by all our member states, and this is where the role of mass media is really important. We also saw that interactive methods work very well in awareness raising, and so there need to be developed more concrete interactive tools which can be used in training sessions for local actors. Municipalities should play a much larger role in rehabilitation and reintegration assistance and in providing long-term support than they currently do. It should be improved not only because it's a moral duty and because it will decrease human suffering, but also because well-organized and comprehensive victim support will lead to economic benefits in the long run. Because prevention is better than cure, directing resources to crime prevention, outreach work and awareness raising would benefit would be even more cost effective and would benefit municipalities in the long term. And to end on a positive note, we see that municipalities have clear motivation and willingness to cooperate, to improve and strengthen their work in combating human trafficking. And some municipalities do simply excellent job. But they would benefit from regular guidance and support from national agencies dedicated to prevent human trafficking. And good local practices should be highlighted more to increase the willingness of less active municipalities to participate in anti-trafficking efforts. And we all need to remember that from little things, big things grow. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vineta, for your presentation, and allow me to commend you for the for your work, crucial work on involving municipalities and other local authorities in the prevention and combating of human trafficking. I believe that example you provided in your presentation about unique role of municipalities in creation of free of exploitation labor market is very important and very topical issue for many countries. I know for sure that it's very topical for Belarus, and for example, the information you provide about guidelines for local authority will be very useful, and I believe that I provide this information to our Center for Anti-Trafficking Training, and we should plan together with Latvia, of course, to organize such training for local actors, for local representatives in Belarus. It will be very, very useful and very unique. I mean, unique practicality for Belarus. We should learn from you and should work closely together. One more important topic you highlighted is the role of mass media, and especially local mass media, in the awareness-raising campaigning against human trafficking. Because I believe that we should recognize that mass media, especially local mass media, are not so active as they could and should be in prevention human trafficking, in awareness raising, in mobilizing of many different actors at the local, specifically at the local level. And thank you very much for highlighting this specific aspect of our joint work, joint collaboration of all stakeholders in combating trafficking at the national level. Our next speaker is Mr. Svein Dale, Coordinator Measures Against Human Trafficking, Oslo Commune. Mr. Dale has a bachelor degree in social science and a bachelor degree in social work, and continuing education in administration and planning, as well as child protection service and management. He started his working life in two of the broadest reaching NGOs for disabled and handicapped in Norway during 1981-1988. In 1989, he started in social service. He started his activity in the social services of Oslo. First in the district of Grorund. In early 1992, he moved to the social service in the district of Grünerløkka, where he currently works. He first began work connected to trafficking in human beings in 2004. Since 2011, he is the coordinator in Oslo, and Mr. Dahl is also a member of Norway's national competence team against forced marriage, genital mutilation, and extreme social control. Our next speaker will discuss the role of the local authorities in preventing and combating trafficking in human beings. The floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much. First of all, I must thank Ambassador Jabusinova for the invitation to speak to you at this conference. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good people of this conference. According to the main issue of the conference, I will give you a short glimpse of how the work in Oslo with victims of trafficking in human beings has developed. I work in the social services in Oslo, in a country with an advanced welfare system, and where the Social Benefits Act also gives right to victims of trafficking who are granted a reflection period. While NGOs have an important role in assisting victims, let's not forget the strong value that lies in the using of established structures in the welfare system in providing help. Norway has 422 municipalities, of which Oslo is the largest, with its 673,000 inhabitants. And Oslo in itself is divided into 15 separate districts. In Norway, local self-government is strongly developed. Therefore, many of the public services are delegated to the municipalities. Of these services, the most important to us are working with work unemployment, social security, social benefits, non-specialized healthcare, schools, nursery schools and kindergartens, child protection and child welfare. In every municipality in Norway, there is a labor and welfare office. In Norwegian, it's called NAV. Directly translated to English, this means hub, the effective center of social welfare activities in a municipality. The Labour and Welfare Office has the responsibility for all the services linked to work and unemployment, sick leave, social securities, disabilities and social benefits, as well as a lot of responsibility for coordination of these, both within themselves and with healthcare, child welfare, etc. These offices really are hubs in the public services in the municipalities. I work in one of the 15 hubs in Oslo, but my office is responsible for working with all the adult victims of trafficking in human beings in all of Oslo. We have seen a need for a certain degree of specialization in this field. And my hub also has the responsibility to give guidance to other hubs in Norway on what to do with victims of trafficking. The core of the work with victims of human trafficking in Norway is this. It's the hub's responsibility. In other words, it's a part of the general public service, and it is the part of the public service with a lot of competence in coordination. In Norway, there is no single government agency or designated non-state actor with primary responsibility for the identification of victims of trafficking. In principle, all agencies, organizations or individuals can find themselves with grounds for concern that the person may be a subject to human trafficking. This includes social workers, police officers, medical staff, labor inspectors, child welfare officials, staff of asylum reception centers, NGOs, etc. They have the statutory duty to identify the person concerned as a possible victim and refer him or her to the relevant authorities and assistance programs. The person concerned will regularly be advised to apply to the Directorate of Immigration for a reflection period of 6 months, which is granted to possible victims. The responsibility for follow-up is then assigned to the municipality where the person is staying. And since Norway is quite an advanced welfare state, municipalities have broad experience in assisting people of many different national and cultural backgrounds with a multitude of challenges and needs. I can add that our system for assisting normal asylum seekers that have been granted to stay in Norway is such that the person will be sent to a specific municipality where housing and other needs are provided by the municipality. It's not possible to choose for yourself where you want to live, as this would result in the establishment of ethnic communities that will hinder integration in society. Of course, many municipalities are small and will see advantages in using specialized services provided by NGOs or central authorities. Assistance given by municipalities will therefore sometimes be limited to giving a regular sum of money to the victim. In larger municipalities, social workers have the capacity and skills to help victims directly. And as I said, my office has the role of guidance, a kind of guidance counselor to the smaller municipalities. Most victims used to be women exploited in prostitution who could benefit from staying in shelters for victims of domestic violence. With an expected increase of male victims exploited in all forms of labor, social workers in municipalities should be able to handle their needs, given some specialized training and guidance. Being granted a reflection period has the effect that the municipality where the victim is staying has the responsibility to assist the victim. This can be a major challenge for social services, especially the first time a victim is present in the municipality. When a reflection period is granted, We do not have a specific package of measures or special services according to the nature of trafficking for the person considered as a victim. But the local hub has the responsibility to consider how assistance can be granted to this particular special person. In Oslo, that means my office. And it's important to notice that it's the resident permit in itself that gives a person access to the public services, not why the permit is granted. And if the person is a citizen of a country within the European Economic Cooperation, all the rules about not being a burden for the welfare system in the resident country are put aside during the residency on a reflection period. So, in Norway, it's the local governmental responsibility to provide assistance to victims. I wish to underline that my presentation deals only with assistance for adult victims. Child victims of trafficking are the matter of the Child Protection Act. This applies to all children staying in Norway, residence permit or not. As I've said, Oslo has the most cases of human trafficking in Norway. Each year, my office works with between 50 and 70 cases. Some years ago, when most of the focus of the work with trafficking in human beings was on prostitution, the system was organized so as one of the outreach services, as a project and an NGO, should give services to the persons considered possible victim until a reflection period was granted. And this works just fine, as long as the victims are in one of the NGO's target groups. When new groups appear, for instance, cleaners, au pairs, people in forced labor, etc., problems and conflicts arise. And this will be the case when the main responsibility is given to an NGO, and the bias will be on the NGO's target groups. The really big issue in this situation was housing and protection. Who had the responsibility when a possible victim was discovered until a reflection period was granted? Well, not the hub office, of course, because the rule said we had to wait for the residence permit, according to the restrictions set by the government in the action plan. And this created a lot of conflicts. My hub office in Oslo had to make a choice. We could either put further pressure on central government to build a special service, another special service, for the transition period, or we could become more flexible ourselves. Today, it gives me great pleasure to say that we chose the latter. Even if the rule set had a restriction that a resident permit must be granted before access to the services is given. It's of the utmost importance here to consider that the law in question, the Social Benefits Act, leaves nearly all of the decisions to discretion. In addition, my office has a long tradition of adapting a flexible and practical approach. We previously saw a challenge in the fact that the victims had to wait for quite some time for the decision on residence in a reflection period, and they were left without the right to assistance and protection. So my local hub office in Oslo decided to give access to the services from the day this person applied for a reflection period. And this meant that the whole waiting period was reduced to 1 or 2 days. The service given from the hub is first and foremost housing and money for life sustenance. We can provide small apartments where victims live on their own. And then the responsibility for coordinations of measures and services starts. Home visits are important to us. We want to meet the persons who are victims of trafficking on their home turf, not always in an office. That's our home turf. And then we follow them to the health services, police, lawyers, etc., if necessary. We do not want them to be idle either in their everyday life. So we urge them to work, and we try to organize work training, qualification programs, and education. And we find that most of them have some kind of activity, from work to studying at the university. And this, of course, gives them possibility of building new and different networks than those they have just escaped. And in all of this, we cooperate with the NGOs. The local governance by the Hub Office is the key. Public responsibility for the important measures and for the coordination is of the utmost importance. The specialized outreach services and NGOs are a very important part of the work. But as long as the main responsibility is governmental and unified, the entirety will be unbiased. In Oslo, we now enjoy a quiet and stable situation, where the roles are more clearly defined than before between the municipal responsibility and the NGOs. The many participants in this work are working together, all due to a simple decision by a public office to have a more flexible approach, and of course by bending the rules a bit. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mr. Dalla, for your wonderful presentation. All of us know that generally, in a general practice, human trafficking is being handled by central authority. But your presentation shows us very well how it could be done at the level of the local authority, at the level of municipality, and such offices as your Hub office in Oslo. And thank you. Your role of your Hub office as a guidance for small municipality is very important and very interesting experience, which will be, I believe, will be useful for many countries and many municipal authorities. And you vividly show us how to overcome the challenge of lack of cooperation between big cities, central authorities and local authorities, how to work with victims, especially child victims, how to work effectively. And thank you very much one more time for your responsible attitude to the countering trafficking in persons at the local level. Thank you very much for your responsibility for working with victims of human trafficking, children and adult victims, and my congratulations on your impressive work in Oslo on prevention and combating human trafficking. Thank you. Dear colleagues, I have the pleasure to introduce our next speaker. We have some challenges in our schedule, and our next speaker is Mr. Barry Makilop, who is the Deputy Director of Operations at the Financial Transactions and Reports Analysis Center of Canada, FinTrack, responsible for financial intelligence, as well as the supervisory and complaints role of the agency. Prior to this, Mr. Makilop worked at Public Safety Canada, where he held various senior positions over 9 years, including Director General of Law Enforcement, Organized Crime and Broader Strategies, Senior Director of National Strategies, and Director of Summit Security, Contract Policy and Firearms Policy. Mr. Makilov began his career in the non-profit sector with the Youth Services Bureau of Ottawa and has also held positions in other federal government organizations, including both the Privy Council Office and Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat. He holds a Master of Arts degree in criminology from the University of Ottawa. And so Mr. Makilov will discuss how cooperation between financial institutions, financial intelligence unit, and the law enforcement could contribute to identifying trafficked victims by tracking suspicious financial transactions and bringing criminals to justice. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. And I'd like to, I guess I have to push. Thank you. See, you come up here quickly, you don't know what you're doing. And I do want to thank the Ambassador, even though she left, for inviting me to give an opportunity to speak to you today about one of the ways that Canada is helping address and attack human trafficking. It is not the only way, of course, but it is one of the ways. FINTRAC itself, for those that don't know, is Canada's financial intelligence unit. And normally, to explain exactly how FINTRAC works and what we do, it's about a day-long presentation, so we won't go there. Unless you want to, I'm available later, I can explain more. But in the meantime, we'll just go very quickly to address some of the issues that were raised even yesterday about the importance of following the money. FINTRAC itself is both the regulator and the Financial Intelligence Unit in Canada, which gives us a very unique opportunity to use levers that don't exist everywhere else. It allows us to work, and as you see the motto up top, the compliance for intelligence, and then taking that, and we do the compliance and the intelligence part, and we perform analysis. We do tactical analysis on individual investigations that are undertaken by law enforcement, and we also do proactive disclosures to our law enforcement, national security agencies to launch investigations either related to money laundering or terrorist financing. And as you see, what we can do is by working with our reporting entities, and that includes banks, credit unions, money services, businesses, as well as casinos and others, we help establish for them and with them a culture of compliance that really looks at doing compliance not because they have to by law, but it's compliance because it's the right thing to do. And in order to get there, you really have to see them as a partner, and they have to see themselves as a partner in the fight against money laundering and terrorist financing. And as you see the loop at the end, the feedback and guidance is as important as us. Could you tell Mom that I'm busy? Thank you. As you see, the feedback at the end, the feedback and guidance is as important as what they have to do by law, is for us to give them feedback and guidance on what they're doing, how they're doing it, and whether or not what they're doing is assisting the investigations that we want our law enforcement to undertake. So when it comes to human trafficking, the first thing that we did, Timea Nagy, who's a victim of human trafficking, actually spoke at a conference in Canada in December of 2015, and she challenged the banks to follow the money and to use the money trail to help fight human trafficking. One of the gentlemen from the Bank of Montreal, Peter Warwick, stood up and said that he would volunteer to lead this initiative on the behalf of the private sector, providing, of course, that FINTRAC would turn around and support him. As the regulator and as the intelligence unit, we saw definite benefits in doing this, and it was the first time that we actually stepped out of our normal role, I guess, and took up a very concerted effort in a public-private partnership to develop very specific actionable indicators linked to human trafficking and linked to the financial transactions that cover human trafficking. Within that context, it was very easy, once we started that, to get other banks involved and to bring in other reporting entities such as money services businesses who all saw that they themselves had a role to play in combating human trafficking. Obviously, human trafficking being the type of crime that it is, it was easy to get people involved, easy to get people concerned about this. And when we saw the extent of this in Canada, it was something that was very easy to develop this public-private partnership. So what we did was we worked with them, and it's easy to give out topologies and general topologies, looking at what it is that human trafficking is, how it works in the world, what the global impact is. What was more important was to work with them to develop very core, very specific indicators that they could then use in their own institutions, fine-tune their own systems, and identify suspicious transactions related to human trafficking. We in Canada have mandated reporting for transactions over $10,000, as in many other countries. We also get electronic fund transfers that come from inside or outside of Canada over $10,000. But as you know, when it comes to human trafficking, we're not seeing those kinds of amounts of money going through. So what was important was to get the non-threshold reports, the suspicious transactions, and to provide the banks and other reporting entities with very, very specific transactional types that they could fine-tune their systems, reduce the false positives, and provide us with very good intelligence. In order to do that, of course, we could do that looking at our own database. We produced a strategic intelligence report that we used to start the conversation, but then we worked with financial institutions, we worked with our law enforcement, we worked very, very closely with our law enforcement in Canada, we worked with NGOs and other relevant institutions to make sure that we could validate the indicators that we were suggesting were related to human trafficking, get them to identify for us those indicators that we did not perhaps know about. We looked at a tactical analysis of the 250 million transactions we have in our database in order to identify further indicators. And then we developed an intelligence product, an operational alert. We based it on both a domestic and an international scan of what exists out there, what type of indicators exist, and what other countries are using. TPS, RCMP, I know for the rapporteur, I'll try to break up the acronyms here. That's the Toronto Police Service, our Royal Canadian Mounted Police, our Five Eyes partners, the Financial Action Task Force, and we used Egmont as well. And we developed an iteration of drafts with feedback from the reporting entities. So as soon as we got feedback from our police or from our reporting entities, we would change the draft, we would modify it, and we would provide them with another draft until we got to a final operational alert that we put out. We put it out publicly, so it is available on our website. Our entities have used it, they've fine-tuned their systems, and they've started reporting ever since basically the end of 2015 is when they started reporting. So the question would be, did we get any results? Was it worth it? Was it worth the effort? And the results, I think, speak for themselves. As you see here, we went from 450 transactions, suspicious transaction reports in our database in 2015. We're now well over 4,200 in 2017, and it continues to grow. So there has been a significant increase in suspicious transactions, which has led to a significant increase in our disclosures to law enforcement. So we went from 19 disclosures in 2015 to close to 200 in 2017, and we're now well over 300 disclosures in 2018 already, which identifies networks of people and victims involved in human trafficking. The small pie charts on the right, you'll see the reactive versus proactive are the disclosures that we've sent to law enforcement in Canada or internationally. In 2015, we probably had an average of, it was almost 50-50 was reactive versus proactive. Based on the operational alert, based on the work we've done with our public-private partnership, we've gone now to about 70% of our disclosures are proactive. That means that these disclosures are actually leading investigations. They're leading our law enforcement partners to identify suspected traffickers, and they're leading them to arrests and hopefully prosecutions. I say hopefully because prosecutions take a long time in Canada, so we've seen only a few since the project started, but there will be more, I am sure. We just had a recent arrest in Toronto where there was an international ring linked to Portugal, and there were well over 200 people, victims who were identified and removed from the trade of human trafficking, and the suspected traffickers were arrested. So what are some of the common indicators of money laundering related to human trafficking, and this is where it gets very specific. If you look at some of the travel-related purchases, multiple point-of-sale transactions, this is where we're asking banks to look at transactions related to, and this is obviously more than one indicator in order to suspect that it's related to human trafficking, otherwise it would just be a one-off. But if you look at the transactions related to car rental agencies, local hotels, motels, we've seen in Canada in some cases, we could have 3 or 4 or 5 different motels being rented on the same day in 5 different cities by the same person. That's an indicator. If we look at distance transportation, a lot of one-way airline tickets, one-way train tickets, one-way bus ticket purchases, perhaps one person purchasing 5 or 6 plane tickets to one city. They do have to move the girls. In this case, we're looking at sexual exploitation for the most part. The girls are being moved by bus, by train, by plane. Local transportation as well, lots of taxi, lots of Uber services, lots of vehicle rentals, ride-sharing services, and so forth. And when you combine that with multiple points of sale transactions at drugstores, lots of condoms, lots of lubricant, lots of other things that are being purchased at drugstores, lots of makeup, lots of relatively cheap clothing, lots of purchases at beauty stores, and a lot of fast food restaurants. We've seen transactions where we would have one account spending $40, $50, $60, $70 at McDonald's on a daily basis. That tends to be definitely an indicator. Not very many people, and it's not to say there's anything wrong with eating McDonald's, but if you're eating $100 worth of McDonald's a day, it's probably not good for you, and probably you're not doing it by yourself. So we do ask them to look for these things and to make sure that they report to us. Again, excessive accommodation transactions, many hotels, motels, not the high-end ones necessarily, but not always low-end ones either. And as I said, we've seen several where we would have 5 or 6, perhaps even in the same city, and the same person renting 5 or 6 motel rooms over the course of a day or 2 days or a week. That is indicative of, at least in our case, indicative of human trafficking in Canada. And we've received several STRs, or suspicious transaction reports, related to that. It's easy when you work in the business to use the acronyms. I will try not to. So what we do is we take the suspicious transaction reports, we look at the other 250 million transactions we have in our database, and what we do is we produce actionable disclosures for our police forces in Canada, as well as for international FIUs. If we see a nexus to another country, we will certainly send that information to the FIU of that country, and they can then share it on with their law enforcement. This here is a relatively small case, and what we see in this case is, if you look at the red dots, those would be suspected traffickers that police suspect or perhaps have already charged with trafficking human beings. If you look at the blue ones, those are additional subjects that we've identified through financial transactions. And I'll let you just look at that for a minute, because the benefit of the financial transactions is that all the ones in blue are ones that our police forces did not know about. So when we ask whether or not there's a benefit to following the money, and whether or not following the money can help enumerate and elucidate certain transactions, certain networks related to human trafficking, this is an example. The 2 in green are particular and were a source of pride, I guess, for my analysts, in that those 2 in green were actually missing women. They were identified in police databases as missing women. Police did not know where they were. We were able, through the financial transactions, to identify these women and to help identify where they could be found. So while Project Protect was extremely successful, continues to be very successful, what we've learned from it is really the benefit of a public-private partnership, the benefit of developing partners, the benefit of developing indicators that are specific to crime typologies, allowing them to fine-tune their system and to make the indicators as specific as possible in order to identify the transactions related to that particular type of crime. We've taken this outreach relatively far. Our Human Trafficking Investigators course, that's a course that's offered by our Canadian Police College. FinTrack has been invited to teach at that course, so we do provide a day-long course there. We deal with the Ministry of Public Safety on the Human Trafficking Task Force in Canada. We do a significant amount of law enforcement outreach. We work continuously with our reporting entities, credit unions, banks, money services businesses. We've actually provided training to our Crown prosecutors as well, which is, again, an area that's hard to bring in at times. We heard that yesterday. And we've done a number of conferences and speeches at ACAMS, which is the Association of Certified Anti-Money Laundering Specialists in both Canada and the United States. We've also done a number of international outreach efforts, usually over the more than 15 minutes, so we usually go into a lot more detail in terms of how to set this up and how we can do it and how it can be done in other countries. The key is trying to get law enforcement and the private sector and your FIU to work together. We do not share target names with the financial entities. That's not what we do. It's indicator-based. So we don't have the privacy issue of sharing specific target names. Law enforcement in Canada doesn't share the names of specific suspects with the financial institutions, but by providing specific indicators, we nevertheless generate the results that we've seen. We've worked with the United Nations as well, Interpol, and our other FIUs through Egmont and the Financial Action Task Force. We've also taken it domestically, and we've used a similar approach to launch 2 other projects. The first being Project Chameleon, which is a mass marketing fraud project looking at indicators related to romance scams. And we've seen a significant increase in STRs in suspicious transaction reports related to that already. And our last one was Project Guardian. We launched that in February of 2018. Again, we adopted the same approach to identifying the indicators and to providing the indicators as broadly as possible and as specific as possible. So as broadly as possible to our reporting entities, and the indicators are specific to the sale, procurement, and trafficking of fentanyl. And we've also created another operational alert related to that. And in the month of March, I guess, 1 month after the launch, we already had somewhere close to 40 proactive disclosures on fentanyl, which, as people know, is another issue that is a plague in our societies, at least in Canada, the States, and I'm guessing around the world. So it's another opportunity and another way of fighting very specific, very heinous crimes that we see in our own countries. And I'll just leave that there for now. I certainly open to any questions that you have, and I thank you, Madam Moderator.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. McKillop. And I do believe when Madam Jarbusinova decided to convene this event, she was thinking of the need to complement important political statements that are usually made in the different halls, General Assembly, OSCE, etc., with a keener focus on practicality. And presentation which we just heard right now from Mr. McKillop was vivid and excellent example of such kind of practicality. The work which was done by FinTrack is unique, and the development of special indicators which help to track specific transaction related to human trafficking is very important work that should be done at, I believe, at every country. Every country is a national level, and your experience is unique and very useful for other countries. And Mr. McKillop, I would like to congratulate you for your very important work in the fight of human trafficking, and look forward to continue working closely together. And ladies and gentlemen, now we have exhausted the list of the panelists, and I would like to open the floor for your questions, comments, and observation. In the interest of time, I kindly ask you to introduce yourself and keep the questions or statement short, because as far as I understand, we have just 7 minutes till the coffee break. And so I have the list of speakers, and the first in my list is a representative of the Russian Federation. Please.
Ladies and gentlemen, I represent the Prosecutor General's Office of the Russian Federation. And this is the organization which is responsible for coordinating crime fighting in our country. Russia is a participant in many different international conventions on protecting the individual, so that on preventing THB, especially women. And we have also signed up to the additional protocol to the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. In Russia, we have a system for assisting victims of THB, and in our national legislation, there is an obligation on the police to provide first aid and first response. Our laws also enshrine the right to free first aid, qualified legal aid, information in the mother tongue, and a guarantee of personal safety and security in administrative and penal cases, and also to prevent any moral or physical suffering. And we also work on protecting children from THB, especially sexual exploitation, and that is done through our accession to the optional protocol to the Treaty on the Rights of the Child. We think that children require special assistance and protection, and so we have a centre for social assistance to families and children, a rehabilitation centre, social refuges for children and teenagers. And these would be young people who have suffered psychological or physical abuse, and they can receive psychological or educational assistance, social protection, everyday assistance, medical assistance, and rehabilitation services. These are our basic values, and they drive Russia to fight THB together with our CIS colleagues. The Council of Head of States of the CIS has a document on combating THB, and realising the plans under this concept and oversight for implementation lies with the Council of Prosecutors General of the CIS states. At the same time, the Prosecutor General's Office has memoranda of understanding with the Prosecutors General and national high courts of various countries. Currently, we have 83 such agreements in place. As part of their implementation, we exchange information on crime fighting, including on slavery, the provision of legal aid. We hold conferences and consultations when it comes to extradition proceedings. We believe that many violations are latent. We see modern slavery through forced marriages, inappropriate adoptions, child pornography, and the provision of cheap labour. And so my office is doing everything possible to combat these negative phenomena. The prosecutor is a coordinator for the Internal Affairs Ministry, migration bodies, and other agencies from civil society and the government. When it comes to fighting forced labour, we have coordinating meetings between agency working groups involving all stakeholders, all the various services. In Russian law, we have a very broad understanding of forced labour in comparison to international legal norms. And those would be the ones in the ILO Convention. Labour can be judged to be forced if it was not agreed to willingly. And when prosecutors or labour inspectors carry out checks, it is taken into account that forced labour could include things such as a worker having additional functions without written agreement, being asked to do overtime, failure to fully pay or to pay on time, salary payments. And the prosecutor then works to ensure that workers are paid and those responsible are prosecuted. Often, the victims of THB are those who have illegally crossed international borders, travelling with falsified documents. They might work in secret. This is unacceptable. Often, such individuals are detained or deported. So what we try to do is focus on giving them back their violated rights. We also focus on trying to assist Russians who have travelled abroad and are being exploited. This often happens through international agencies, such as marriage agencies or travel agencies. The prosecutor works together with operational services to cut off the sources of these living wares so that they don't leave the country. Given the multifaceted character of labour exploitation of children using the internet, annually we work with the courts to try and block several thousand websites which promote prostitution or pornography involving minors. At the initiative of the prosecutor, cases are brought against those who produce pornography with images of children. An important part of preventing such THP-related crimes is played by the Healthcare Oversight Agency, and we do everything we can to prevent abuse by medical workers, also violations when it comes to donation of human tissues and organs. In Russia, we have a ban on the purchase and sale of human organs and tissues, and this is subject to criminal prosecution. In conclusion, I should like to note that the system that we have for countering THP in the Russian Federation makes it possible to rapidly respond to the most urgent challenges of our age, inter alia, by taking account of international experience. We are always ready to respond to new forms of crime and improve our methods when it comes to law enforcement. Thank you.
Thank you very much for presentation of the national experience of the Russian Federation in the countering trafficking in persons. I'd like personally to underline one very important issue. Russian Federation is our very trusted, invaluable partner, which together with the UNDP and Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights organized already a number of projects on the basis of the Center Against Human Trafficking in Minsk for international partners, for the representatives of the Group of Friends United Against Human Trafficking, on the very important topics, strengthening international cooperation in combating human trafficking in the context of human rights. And we're looking forward for continuing such cooperation together with the Russian Federation and our international partners. The next speaker in my list is representative of Ukraine. Please, you have the floor.
Здравствуйте, уважаемые.
Hello, dear participants. First of all, I'd like to thank the OSCE for having organized this conference and for providing us with the possibility to participate. I represent the National Police of Ukraine and the Special Department in fighting against THB. And this conference speaks to the need for cooperation and partnership in countering THB. In Ukraine, the cooperation mechanism in countering THB is regulated by our legislation, and Ukraine has acceded to all international acts which and brought our legislation in conformity with them, these acts which counter trafficking in human beings. There is a very clear definition of those carrying out events in countering THB, and there has been a provision issued, or a decree rather, by the ministry, which provides for mechanisms of cooperation on the part of these various actors in Ukraine, such as the Council of Ministers, as well as the national and local authorities, such as police authorities, as well as bodies of regional autonomy and civil society organizations and individual citizens. The activities through this decree, there has been a clear order and action defined at all of these various levels for cooperation in countering trafficking in human beings. The national coordinator in countering THB in Ukraine carries out our social policy, which also provides assistance to victims in order to counter THB effectively. In 2005, we created a specialized division which has as its scope the entire territory of Ukraine and includes more than 350 personnel. In Ukraine, we have received a positive assessment from our international partners, and in 2017, Ukraine was struck from a list of the most vulnerable countries by the U.S. State Department. Let me, in conclusion, express my gratitude to the Office of the Project Coordinator in Ukraine, thanks to which the mechanisms for cooperation and partnership existing in Ukraine have been developed and have allowed us to implement a number of OSCE projects in this area. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation. And next speaker in my list is a representative of Albania. Albania, you have the floor.
My dear colleagues, hello to everybody. It's my pleasure to attend the 80th Conference of the Islands Against Trafficking in Human Beings. Well, I want to share only some things, some concrete points with you, just like a best practice from Albania. I'm national coordinator on the fight against trafficking in human beings from 1 year now, but with a lot of experience. Well, I can say that the national referral mechanism is a positive and highly efficient model, which in Albania, which is composed of 13 state and non-state institutions and structures. So this is the basis of what we talked in yesterday, but also today, of cooperation between state institutions and NGOs and other actors. So we have Ministry of Health, Ministry of Education, Ministry of Interior, Ministry of Foreign Affairs even, but we have also 4 biggest international organizations such as IOM, etc. And also part of our NRM are 4 reception and reintegration centers of victims of trafficking. Well, going to local responses, one of the panelists just mentioned here, yes, we have a very good model. We have regional committees on the fight against trafficking in person. So in Albania we have 12 regions, and in the 12 regions we have 12 regional committees that work closely with which are composed by local authorities in the territory, and they work very closely with municipalities and other local institutions, state institutions and NGOs there. So it's really a very, very good model, and it is working really very, very good in Albania. Well, in addition to this, I want to mention that anti-trafficking measures also were included in two very important documents in Standard Operating Procedures and our National Action Plan 2018-2020. So anti-trafficking measures are included in areas such as migration, asylum and child protection. So in cooperation with OSCE, UNHCR, IOM and UNICEF, we are working to address the phenomenon of vulnerability of potential victims of trafficking among migrants, while we are working to review migration treatment procedures. A new migration strategy is under drafting, and one of its objectives will be the prevention of human trafficking and exploitation. Specific attention, if we go to the business, so to private sector, specific attention has been paid to build partnership with the business sector, either in the view of employing victims of trafficking as well as identifying and preventing trafficking thereof. In cooperation with OSCE in Albania, the business have adopted a code of conduct on employment of persons under 18 years old. Last year, we organized also a number of workshops with owners and administrators of the hotel sectors and travel agencies, you know, HoReCa system, hotel, restaurants and cafes, for the identification and prevention of human trafficking in cooperation with ICMPD and regional anti-human trafficking committees. Regional and international cooperation also, it is very important, and it was mentioned here from the panelists, has been in focus of our work. In addition to the international cooperation, I can just mention some of the agreements we have and protocols we've signed, and bilateral meetings were organized with the counterpart authorities of England, Greece, Kosovo, Montenegro and Macedonia as well. Joint standard operating procedures were signed by the end of the year 2016 with the help of OSCE support between our neighbor countries, so Albania, Kosovo and Montenegro, and I'm convinced that our regional cooperation model is worth being considered as a positive example and good practice for other countries, both for the region and the EU. I just wanted the last sentence to mention what we are doing, and I want to share it with you. We are trying to build an advisory board. It's just a US model, but we're trying to do it. It would be just an advisory council to give recommendations to my office, to me. We want to give to the ex-victims of trafficking a voice. We want to hear things from their perspective. So it is very easy, you know, to make policies, to make strategies, or to think by our own, but I think we have to give a voice to them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Albania. And I have two speakers in my list, and I kindly ask the next speakers to limit your intervention to 3 minutes. And so, NGOs Alternativa, Russian Federation. You have the floor, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You're right. I represent the volunteer organization Alternativa, or Alternative in Russia, which has been working for over 16 years now, and we try to help those who are being forced to do things and offer them direct assistance. The peculiarity of our organization is the fact that we have a group of volunteers who carry out special operations to rescue people, depending on where the information comes from. It might be a report from the relatives or the victims themselves. We work throughout Russia and also abroad. We provide direct assistance in obtaining documents, legal assistance, medical assistance if necessary. We organize transportation, help people get home again. We also help our victims find new jobs or education. And this was something that took a lot of work. And we had many more people 6 years ago who needed assistance than we could help to rehabilitate. Often our volunteers would take people home with them, violating all of the recommendations of international organisations. They had no regard for their own safety. They just wanted to help because there was nowhere else they could take these people. Gradually, a keen awareness emerged of the fact that we needed a national mechanism for redirecting the victims, that we needed partnerships, and we started to develop such partnerships with the relevant partners. What do we have now then? Currently, we have cooperation in place with workers from the Moscow Criminal Investigation Service, which finds victims of trafficking. We've also worked together in operations to try and prevent parents from trying to sell their children or rescuing girls who would go into sexual exploitation. We work together with the Internal Ministry branch in Dagestan. Tomorrow there will be a meeting with our volunteers in Dagestan to discuss cooperation on trying to prevent slavery. We also work together with the transport police in the run-up to the football championships. We've noticed that some women have been arriving from Nigeria, for example. We believe that there could be something of a flood of such young women for sexual exploitation. You don't have much time left. And we've also got an ombudsman in St. Petersburg. We work together with them. The media, parliamentarians, social rehabilitation centres, priests, medical services that help people with HIV and AIDS. These are all people we work with. We've got partnerships both in Russia and abroad. And what I want to say is that these partnerships with charities in Uzbekistan and other countries have led to the establishment of a trans-border association for Russia, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. We hope that this network will continue to develop and that we'll be able to add other countries of origin to the list of participants. So that's what we've managed to do over the past 6 years. This mechanism operates and we are now able to work with the victims much better. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the last speaker in my list, OSCE Parliamentary Assembly representatives. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. I would like to first of all thank all the speakers for their interesting remarks. I would also like to congratulate the Special Representative for convening this this very important yearly appointment, which is the Alliance Conference, but also for her leadership and focus, I think, during the last 4 years of her mandate, which has been looking at very interesting aspects in our work. The Alliance this year is it's one of those elements, of course, on partnerships, but also we would like to underline her efforts in looking at trafficking in the context of several crisis areas and situations, including migrations, conflicts, links with other types of crime, and so on. We, as OSCE Parliamentary Assembly, enjoy really a good and sincere cooperation with the Office of the Special Representative and with other OSCE executive structures working on combating human trafficking. Just to remind a few of this, I would underline the joint visit that we had in 2016 to the hotspots in Lampedusa, Italy, at the very outset of the, let's say, so-called migration crisis. But also the recent contribution of the Special Representative to the work of our Migration Committee, which has been looking at many aspects also of human trafficking during the last winter meeting. The OSCPA has been indeed at the very forefront in addressing and bringing awareness to the topic of human trafficking and the need to build partnerships since 1999, when we had our first resolution on the topic, which was actually on combating trafficking of women and children, which also underlines a very strong focus and emphasis of the Parliamentary Assembly on the issue of, in particular, the vulnerabilities of children, especially, and women. We have a very active and dynamic special representative since 2004, whom Madame Ambassador Jabusinova met several times, Congressman Smith from the United States. I think that since 1999, almost every single year, we had a resolution in our annual sessions dealing with these problems. The latest ones were in Minsk, adopted last year, on online sexual exploitation of children. Many of these resolutions are often then discussed and debated here as well, and they become then often, or they're taken as an inspiration for new ministerial declarations of the OSCE, so there's a really strong synergy also there. I would also like to take this opportunity, of course, to thank Honourable Tilvar for clearly and eloquently outlining the central role of national parliaments in addressing issues related to human trafficking and in building partnerships in this field. I think the Romanian experience is indeed a very interesting one and could be easily labeled as a really good practice. And I think it should be replicated in as many national parliaments as possible. We are happy to play our part and contribute to make sure that this kind of best practices are shared further, and we welcome and we look forward to the opportunity to work with all of you. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, colleagues, for your very brave but very pointed presentation with regard to the activity of the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly on the counter trafficking area. And so, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for productive discussion so far, and I am looking forward to see you after the coffee break, and we will start at 11:15. We have 3 more speakers, and we will conclude our session. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for rejoining us after the coffee break. And I'm glad to introduce our next speaker, Ms. Flor Molina, member of the U.S. Advisory Council on Human Trafficking of the United States of America. Ms. Molina is representative of very important partners, very important stakeholders of countering human trafficking. Survivors, trafficking survivors, with a role to advise and make recommendation for authorities at the federal, local level to form the anti-trafficking policies to the President's Interagency Task Force to monitor and combat trafficking in persons. This is a unique mechanism in the OSCE area, and the purpose of the intervention of Ms. Molina is to show that human trafficking survivors can greatly contribute to the fight against this crime. Ms. Flor Molina, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate at this conference. And as you said, to combat human trafficking, we play a huge role. As human trafficking survivors, we know firsthand what we need and why it's so important to combat human trafficking. As a member of the U.S. Advisory Council, I'm here to talk how was created our group and what's our chore as a U.S. Advisory Council members. The U.S. Advisory Council on Human Trafficking was comprised of 11 leaders who bring their knowledge and experience to advise and provide recommendations on federal anti-trafficking policies to the President's Interagency Task Force to monitor and combat trafficking in persons. The Council was established on May 29, 2015 by Section 115 of the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act, also known as the Survivors of Human Trafficking Empowerment Act. And in December 2015, President Barack Obama appointed the 11 members of the Council to provide advice and recommendations to the U.S. government, specifically the Senior Policy Operating Group, SPOG, and the PITA to strengthen federal policy and programming efforts to reflect best practices in the anti-trafficking field. review the U.S. government policy and programs intended to combat human trafficking, including programs relating to provision of services for victims, gather information from U.S. government agencies, states, and the community for the Council's annual report, publish an annual report that contains the findings derived from the reviews conducted of federal government policy and programs, serve as a point of contact for federal agencies reaching out to human trafficking survivors for input on anti-trafficking programming and policies in the United States, represent the diverse population of human trafficking survivors across the United States. The Council brings expertise from its members' personal experiences of human trafficking to conduct its work, and for the purposes of this report, has organized itself into 5 committees to address the following topics: rule of law, public awareness, victim services, labor laws, and grant making. This is how was formed the U.S. Advisory Council, and this is our first report in year 2016. And in year 2017, we also wrote a second report. And on our second report, basically what we did is we wrote about how we made recommendations to the President's Interagency Task Force, but we also recommend in the last part of our report to the White House for survivors to be compensated, because it's well known across the country that we have been recognized as survivors, but up to this date, we haven't been able to get compensated. And that's one of our recommendations of our second report. And lastly, this last month, March 5th, the President, Donald Trump, announced the second term of the U.S. Advisory Council. He appointed 5 of the original members, and he appointed 4 new members. So as of now, we are 9 members of the U.S. Advisory Council. As of now, we haven't met yet, so we don't know how it's going to work, but we do know that we are going to write a report. And thank you so much for inviting me to this important conference.
Thank you very much, Ms. Molina. And I would like to say that the reporting and recommendations of the Advisory Council, comprised from the former victims of trafficking and survivors of trafficking, is very important and unique experience, because these people in particular know very well the situation of the ground. They know very well the needs and understand very well the needs of victims and survivors of human trafficking. And I do believe that their recommendation could contribute to the solid basis of the formation of the governmental policy towards assistance, aimed at the assistance of victims of trafficking and socializations of trafficking survivors. I thank you very much for your courage and for very important job you are doing as a member of the U.S. Advisory Council. And our next speaker is Ms. Linda Latham. She is manager of the Anti-Human Trafficking Team and Women's Health Service Executive, Ireland. She will discuss on the additional efforts that the healthcare professionals, doctors, nurses, pediatricians, emergency services, and others could undertake to prevent human trafficking. Traditionally, the healthcare sector is involved in the rehabilitation and medical support to the victims of human trafficking and their families. Nevertheless, recent initiative in some OSCE participating states have focused on additional efforts in this regard. Capacity building programs have been developed to train healthcare staff to proactively identify victims on trafficking in human beings and refer them to the law competent authorities. And so, Ms. Linda, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Now, I may have a little difficulty because I can't see the screen properly, so I'm going to have to talk. Anyway, initially, Díomh a cuairde agus atá súlagam go maireann sibh taitneamh as an atá le rá agam. So before you further get stressed, I'm going to continue in English as opposed to Gaeilge. And we shall see how I get on with the screen here. And thank you to the OSCE and indeed our own Department of Justice for giving us the opportunity to come to such fantastic conferences, because I think it is really all about, one, about partnership, and two, about knowledge and understanding. And what we see and what I've heard yesterday and so far today has been hugely beneficial in all our efforts to provide holistic services and care to victims of trafficking. So I'm from the HSE, which in Ireland is the Health Service Executive, so we're kind of the Department of Health, more or less, equivalent. And I started out way back in 2000. I'm a registered trained nurse, and I came back to live in Ireland and started out working in the Women's Health Service. And that's a service for women involved in prostitution. And I nursed in the clinics there, and then in 2005 I took over management of that service. So that provides sexual health services, as I mentioned, outreach support for all women affected by prostitution and now sex trafficking. The service grew out of the heroin issues in Dublin around the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, and it was a public health concern that they thought, look, we need to provide services for women who are probably not going into health services otherwise. So it was a very sort of ground-rooted outreach service. Staff would go out on the streets, look to see who they could engage with and try and get women into clinical services. And from there we kind of built up, you know, what we can do. Obviously we do clinical sexual health and contraception. We also did a harm reduction service. But when I took over in 2005, I have to say it didn't sit well with me. So within a very short period of time, I thought, hold on a moment. If we're offering holistic health to women involved in the sex trade, that I really felt it wasn't enough what we were doing. It's very easy as health practitioners to go in and say, great, we can sort that out with an antibiotic, or we can give you condoms, or we can give you needles, and then you're sorted. And back out the women would go onto the streets. And I was going home to my cosy house with new baby and thought, you know, there was a real disparity, a real inequity there, I felt. So I felt, under my management at least, that we needed to branch out further into looking at really what services we were offering women, and are we really doing it justice? Are we really doing them a fair deal when they come in and we just give them some medication or condoms and back out again? So we looked at exit programs, and I now feel that it is absolutely imperative. Now, I'm working a long time with women in prostitution and victims of sex trafficking now for 17 years, 18 years. And it is in my, when I tell you it's in my blood, that's what I mean. It's not a whimsical idea about what services are required. It's really holistic care means looking at the person from every angle. So psychologically, I felt we definitely needed to offer more than just medical service. So exiting pathways. And I would love to be able to tell you that we have it all nailed and that we really can assist women from one position to another and off they go. We haven't, but we're struggling, and we do work with NGOs to that end. In 2002, then, the other team is the anti-human trafficking team. In 2002, our first victim of trafficking walked in the door, and they were two women who'd ran away from a brothel, and they had just got out and said, now, help, we need help. We didn't really understand what had happened to them. They had said they had been brought here against their will, and they ran away from the brothel. So over that period of time, from 2000 really to 2007, we were meeting informally with NGOs, IOM, ourselves, ourselves, health sector, with the Gardaí, which in Ireland is the police force, and we were looking at the phenomenon which is now human trafficking. So by 2007, we had a really good idea of what there was many women coming to Ireland as a destination country for sexual exploitation was the main issue at the time. So I developed the National Care Plan for victims of trafficking, looking at all of the needs. And care plans are very, basic. Somebody comes in, you look at their needs from head to toe, their family reunification issues, their debt bondage. Very often there would be juju or voodoo practices in place, and the hold that has on women, unable to be free to talk about really what happened to them. And I think over time we've really realised that it is not so simple as to get a disclosure, that you must build trust, and that you must go at it at the pace of the person. So now I have two teams, one women's health and one anti-human trafficking. The anti-human trafficking has 5 case workers, and they care plan all victims of trafficking. A couple of years ago we took over labour exploitation as well, and sham marriage. So we now receive referrals for all victims of trafficking in the state. So I'll flick on. Just a moment to talk about the legislation in Ireland. I noticed my countrywoman yesterday, Rachel Moore, I think she's over there, mentioned about the criminalising the purchase of sex. We are delighted to have followed the Nordic model recently in Ireland, and we have now criminalised buyers for purchasing sex and decriminalised women who sell sex. That was a long campaign. There were many NGOs, state parties involved. About 10 years ago, we went to Sweden, and I have to say, we're always blown away by the Swedes and how well they do everything. And one of the first comments, one of the High Court judges said, "Oh, gender equality, we dealt with that 20 years ago." So I was always very impressed when we see good practice like that. So now the law is in place, and now there's a review in 2 years' time, actually. So the real efforts that we'll be looking at the impacts on women, if there's any negative side effects, which we obviously wouldn't wish there to be, but we will be looking at that, we will be documenting that. I'm very pleased to say that I think we've just received funding to do research on women during this period. So we will be analysing the situation prior to the legislation, during the legislation now, and any kind of effects that may occur. So that's really positive, and we're delighted to be part of that. And very pleased that the Nordic model has now been introduced into Ireland. As I said, it was a long effort, and I really see the gains of that. Again, as I mentioned in my blood, when you see the harm of prostitution on women, week in, week out for years now, I think there really is no argument to say it's a fair playing ground. It isn't. It is exploitative, and there is huge inequity in it. So we are pleased. So moving on there. So the HSE human trafficking, I kind of more or less told you, I often talk rather than looking at my slides, but we receive referrals, and this is also an important point, from the national referral mechanism from the Garda Síochána, so the Irish police within the state. So all victims that are come to our service have been already identified, and I think that's, so I think there is a gap in the Irish system, and that is that we need to have outreach looking for victims of trafficking. I know if I was running an outreach looking for them, I would have very good ideas where to be going. So we would be going to the pubs and clubs. We'd be running different kind of outreach initiatives to try and detect and respond then appropriately. So what we do then is we inform VOTs of the process and their entitlements whilst they're undergoing the investigation. We assess, implement, monitor care for all victims of trafficking. Sham marriage is also a big one at the moment, and forced criminality. So selling drugs, particularly car washes, big one in Ireland. Devise a care plan, I've told you that already, short and long-term goals, and we liaise very importantly with all the statutory and NGO services to ensure the best possible outcomes and needs for victims of trafficking. I think partnership is crucial. No one agency can do it all alone, and I think if you engage with people at that level and sort of see, well, what would actually work, I think that's really beneficial. I won't go through because I'm going to run out of time, I won't go through what an assessment and care planning is, but you have a general idea. We look to all angles of healthcare, sexual health, mental health, social welfare payments, legal aid, education and training, employment then eventually, and of course accommodation in the reception and integration agency in the centres, repatriation if patients want to go home. Excuse me, I call everyone patients because I'm a nurse. So it's really, I said yesterday to somebody, I don't mean it in a patronising way, but we kind of handhold victims of trafficking through the whole process of their identification, right through to their investigation, right through to their future care. And very often that is required because there's language difficulties. We go to legal aid appointments with people and they come out and say, what was said? Or we go to a Garda investigation, police investigation, and again, they're looking at us to interpret. So it's very important. It's very important that we don't overestimate or make everything seem a glowing situation, because very often it isn't. It's still a long struggle for rehabilitation, but that's what we do. That's what my team do, and we're always open to constructive criticism on how we can do it better. So it's great to be here. There's just a couple of numbers for you. As I said, these are identified already. So 2014, we saw 36. 2015, if I can read it, we saw 57. 2016, 64, and last year then 44. And the makeup there is sexual labour, forced criminality, sham marriage. We're seeing an increase in sham marriage recently, and the unpleasant effect of that is that they're often targeting sort of people with mild intellectual disability. So very often the young women don't really even know they're in funny situations, or and you're left trying to be very basic and tell them, actually, this isn't a good relationship. Do you see that? He's not so good. He has you as a potential wife, but he also has another few girlfriends. So it's a very basic discussion again with some people. That's just the sex trade in Ireland, mostly indoor, not so much on the streets anymore. Highly organised mobile trade all around the country of Ireland, on the websites. It's all on internet-based and mostly indoor. Women's health I've discussed, I won't go through that. I'll just show you a couple of the stats there. So last year in 2007, women who came into the clinic now for clinical services, 205. Now that's a drop actually. We're about 300, 350. So we're wondering now with the legislation what the impact will be. And if it was a realistic drop, I'd be very pleased, but it probably isn't. So again, it's mostly migrant women in prostitution in Ireland. You can see there's Irish figures are 11 Irish women and UK 3, with the international cohort 191. So, and again, indoors and 192, outdoors too. And those who we knew to be victims of trafficking but don't go forward with disclosures. A large proportion of women do not go forward with disclosures for fear of what the impact of that may be. And just the country of origins, I think, is always an interesting one. Brazil is our largest cohort, so Latin American, we're seeing more and more. Many Brazilians come to Ireland to learn English, to try and improve their life, and we see many of them, unfortunately some of them end up in prostitution. Romania, again, 46 last year. Young Romanian women we're very concerned about because they seem to be very controlled, very pimped, and have, what would I say, desperately vulnerable. That's my feeling, yeah. Nigeria used to be a trend, certainly with victims of trafficking as well. Benin was a big country of origin, and one Mexico and a few different there. So we were asked to speak about inclusive partnerships. We got a very late invitation, so apologies. I haven't done a huge amount of thinking into inclusive partnerships, but I've heard an awful lot over the last couple of days. To date, we were involved in things like the Daphne Fund, a Daphne-funded project, which was the state visit to Sweden I mentioned, and that was very informative in terms of our prostitution legislation. Turn Off the Red Light campaign was a big one with legislators, survivors, and medical professionals. Research with the Immigrant Council of Ireland, globalisation, sex trafficking was a big part of research we did. REACH campaign. So there's been a number of things that I won't go through there, but we are, again, stressing Ireland's a small country. We're 4 million, and really partnership is what it's all about. We all know each other as well, so it's very easy to pick up the phone, anyone who's working in this area, and we know each other's opinions as well, which can be positive or negative. Yeah. I would say that in our national referral mechanism, partnership is key there. So I think it works really well in Ireland. There are, as I said, a few key stakeholders: the police, ourselves, legal aid, and the immigration, as well as the NGO sector. But primarily, we manage all of the referrals through the state parties first, and then we look to the NGO sector for additional support. How am I doing on time? Yes. Okay, so the future. So, I'm not going to talk terribly much about the municipalities. We haven't done terribly much. Definitely awareness raising needs to occur in Ireland. I think survivors and testimonies are really key to why we do what we do. So I think that is fantastic, both yourself, Flor, and Rachel yesterday as well. Really important to hear the words of people who've been affected, because that's why we have these big fancy conferences. That's why we're here in such privilege to come and try and affect change. So I do think that's important. One thing I was thinking about was in relation to medical practitioners and social services and midwives, so the maternity hospitals. In the domestic violence sector in Ireland, we talk about the 3 R's. So to recognise human trafficking, to react to human trafficking, and to refer. So I think that could be a really interesting model that we could adopt for human trafficking. We talk about it in relation to domestic violence, of course. But I think that could be a very interesting model, that because everyone can't be expert. Not every midwife who's there with a young woman and an older man is going to be able to tackle it necessarily. But if she can recognise it, have the space to discuss it, and then refer to specialist services like ourselves, I think that we'd be doing really well. I went to Calais and to Dunkirk in a personal capacity there last year, the year before, to the jungle, and I noticed in Dunkirk, whilst the Red Cross were there and whilst there were official services, women were brought in with their husbands for gynecology assessments, so you get 0 disclosure then. So I just kind of thought that's a key thing. You must see people on their own, you must use language that they understand, you must have interpreters. So there's some key elements that will facilitate disclosures, and we have to get that right as healthcare practitioners. Accident and emergencies, obviously the key place, particularly with labour exploitation, so there could be bruises, there could be anything. Sexual health clinics, all first-line responders need to be able to, as I genuinely feel, recognise, react and refer. Yeah. Now, just to finish up, I'll just be about two minutes. I just wouldn't mind if someone could start that music. And this is a case study for one of our women who we looked after, a young Romanian woman. And this is her story. It's only a couple of minutes, but I think it'll give you... I wonder, could we have the music a little bit louder? Because it's really about the music and her story. I won't talk. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you again for receiving us here to be part of this conference. Thank you.
very much, dear Linda, for your insightful and excited presentation. What are you doing? It's not just offering vulnerable holistic help and care. It's just more important things to help them to find exiting way from the situation. And I would like to wish you success in your future work, you and your team, in preventing trafficking in human beings and supporting victims of this horrible crime. Thank you very much. Our next speaker, actually the last speaker, is Ms. Livia Wagner, coordinator of the Global Initiative Network, private sector advisor, Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. Livia's work covers mainly the issue of human trafficking and business partnership. She coordinates the Responsible and Ethical Business Coalition Against Trafficking, RESPECT initiatives. Before joining the global initiative, she worked as a private sector focal point for the United Nations Global Initiative to Fight Human Trafficking, UN GIFT. She has also worked as a civil servant for the Austrian Foreign Ministry in the Department of Development Cooperation with African countries. She also has private sector work experience in the travel and tourism sector and has, in addition, worked for the non-governmental organization ECPAT in the field of combating commercial sexual exploitation of children and child trafficking. Ms. Wagner has written several publications and is the member of Austrian Association for Sociology. And so, Ms. Wagner, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I'm very honored to be here being invited at the OSCE conference and to be on the same panel as very vibrant and passionate female experts. And may I have the clicker, please? Thank you. I'm going to speak about, we're talking about inclusive partnerships. So it's a great opportunity to have here experts and representatives from different sectors. And I think another sector that sometimes is underestimated on their role, responsibility, but also in their power is the private sector. So today I'm going to speak a little bit about how the private sector can be included more and what is their responsibility in mitigating the risk. But very briefly, one slide on what the Global Initiative is doing. We are a non-governmental organization headquartered in Switzerland. We are the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, and we're looking at different forms of transnational crime. And I'm covering mostly the issue of human trafficking, but basically the Global Initiative is a network of prominent law enforcement, governmental and development practitioners, and who are dedicated to improving the evidence basis and seeking new and innovative approaches to respond to organized crime. So the benefits of addressing human trafficking in supply chains are threefold. Understanding and mitigating and managing the risk of human trafficking is a growing concern in globalized economies. That means human trafficking has a direct impact on business ability to manage their supply chain, but also their recruitment processes, ensure compliance with international and national labor regulations, and of course, human rights standards. So it also, of course, affects how a corporation is perceived by the customers, clients, and partners and investors, and this is very important. So the scrutiny of private sector obligations is basically, we have the regulatory requirements, but also the reputational risks. So studies, they have estimated that multinational corporations today, they make up to 1/3 to 1/2 of the world's largest 100 economies. So that means we should not underestimate the importance and power of those social architects of the last third of the 20th century. And I'm sure everybody of you have heard of the UN Guiding Principles, which is, amongst other prominent, promising frameworks, is a solid starting point, but of course, there are concerns that it doesn't go far enough, because unfortunately the global principles, the guiding principles, are a minimal expected bar for businesses, and they're non-binding, and they are promulgating a series of lowest common denominations. So that means very often also neglecting the complex reality that a company is facing in, for instance, a sourcing country, or having different workers from different ethnic communities. So, but there are other also promising initiatives that, for instance, address ethical recruitment. I'm sure you have heard of the ILO Fair Recruitment Initiative, of the IOM IRIS initiative, of the leadership group on ethical recruitment that is led by the Institute on Human Rights and Business, that also developed the DACA principles. But complementary and at least as important are the regulatory frameworks introduced by the governments. And here it's also the combination of the responsibility shared by the governments and the private sector. So the California Transparency Act was introduced or enacted in 2012, then the UK Modern Slavery Act in 2015, and the EU law on conflict minerals. So as an example, I'm speaking now here about the Modern Slavery Act. There are the obligations and the requirements. So the Transparency in Supply Chain Clause was therefore, unlike the California Transparency Act, which was introduced as a result of customer pressure, the Transparency Supply Chain Clause from the Modern Slavery Act was primarily introduced due to business and investors' demand. And is also significantly broader in scope than any prior legislation. So, however, the compliance of the companies to date has been disappointing. That means a review of the 27 FTSE 100 statements conducted in 2017 concluded that the standard of reporting across the information category is very low. So that means with approximately 50% scoring within the lowest 3 tiers of a 10-tier quality indicator. So the example of the Modern Slavery Act shows that a legal framework is a necessary and important start, but it's not enough. So the ideal combination of the binding legal framework and complementary business-led initiatives to address the remaining voids that are not achieved yet and needs more support from different stakeholders. That means the governments, the business leaders, civil society, survivors, and other stakeholders. And so the interesting thing, or the challenge usually for the companies, is how to translate these obligations into concrete actions, mainly in the sourcing countries or by their suppliers that they don't have so much control over as they would like to have. So at the bottom, there is the legislative framework. That means companies, they have to look at the definitions of the human rights violations or human trafficking or forced labor, child labor, anything that's related to that. The second is the situational analysis, for instance. When you have a certain allegation, then you have to assess the impacts, but also the information gathering from different sources and stakeholder groups in the specific country. Prevention, there it's important to identify the role and the capacity of all the different stakeholder groups. That means it's not only the suppliers and the companies, but also who are the stakeholders on the ground, which are, for instance, victim service providers or health providers and so on, to effectively monitor the supply chain and also do or provide a prompt response to allegations. The mitigation, the next step, is necessary to elaborate and to use qualitative and quantitative indicators and draw on internal and external sources. What is very important here is to use or to see the budget allocations. Very often companies, they're having in their reports, they're saying that they're ensuring that there is no child labor use, no forced labor use, but you have to have a certain budget allocation for that. Specific decisions being made from the CEO level to really ensure this, because otherwise, without a certain budget allocated to that, it's very often or mainly not possible. The fifth step is accounting for. That means very often companies are confronted with allegations and they have to react to that. So what is important is to identify and engage immediately with national stakeholders to respond to this human rights violation or labor rights violation, and also give the access or through other stakeholders allow the access to criminal justice, but also to victim service providers. And our organization, myself, we have been working with an electronic brand that they have been sourcing from an African country, and they were confronted with an allegation of child labor in the mining sector. And based on the legislative framework from the headquarters that they were based in, they had to report on or the brand had to disclose the extractive supply chain actors and undergo a third-party audit process and so on to define which actors are validated as not contributing to gross human rights violations. However, the allegations were verified that child labor had been and forced labor had been used to produce it, and through those obligations that, through the legal framework that they had to comply with, the necessary internal decision-making processes had to be taken. That means they had to be improved because they already had an internal decision-making process allocated. But they also had to, for the first time, introduce remedy guidelines. So what does a company do when they are confronted with it? What does a company do when these allegations are verified? So what does it mean for the child or for the family? What kind of remedy does this victim of trafficking receive? And this is how then a company can, and it's a very long process because it has to be internally approved from the CEO level usually. It's a very long process, but by the time we realize that more and more companies, they are adhering to these processes, which is beyond just complying with standards, but going more into the detail of ensuring it in the sourcing country and checking more thoroughly on their supply chains. Because every company, they have these supplier standards, that is for sure, but that doesn't prevent suppliers to still exploit people or to use child labor. So what we did in cooperation with our Respect partners, we started with a stakeholder needs assessment to realize what the private sector needs. What is it what they're still lacking in information, and where is the lack of knowledge, let's say. So what the response was, and we reached out to 10,000 plus companies around the world, is what the response was that industry best practices was the #1 answer from the companies, as well as in general research and data, and of course putting the international standards into a framework and how to comply with it and what does it mean then on the ground. And the same for general case studies and how to mitigate the risks. So how these needs are translated into other publications is to what are the technical guidance materials they are using or needing to better address this. Are guidances in regional areas, because companies are aware that the situation in the electronic sector in Asia is completely different than, for instance, the mining sector, the informal mining sector in African or Latin American countries. So it has to be really embedded to the regional area, but also, of course, to the industry. I'm going to talk briefly on the Respect Initiative, which was founded this year, but we have been working on it already for a couple of years, jointly with our partners, the UN Migration, the UN Agency on Migration, IOM, and the business school, Babson from the US. And we have founded the Respect Initiative because we realized that there are so many stakeholders, victim service providers, but also the businesses themselves working on this. There is a wealth of information that has been elaborated already, but there is not a single place where all this information is centered. So we founded the Respect Initiative also because we have been working on the webinars, which I'm going to discuss later. And we said, okay, this is going to be one platform where business leaders can come to find all the existing material. And besides that, we also, the online resource center, you can find it under www.respect.international, Respect Resource Center, which is also a peer exchange platform and providing the first of its own targeted webinar series on the role of private sector roles in combating human trafficking. So we have, in the last 4 years, we have conducted 4 webinar series since 2015, conducted with the current one then 24 webinars, inviting 96 speakers from the different groups, and have registrants from all over the world. And it's always, the overarching topic is always how the private sector can be part of how to mitigate the risk of human trafficking in international supply chains. The last I would like to share with you is we are currently working, the Respect partners currently working with the UN Global Compact and GBCAT, which is back to life. We are working on an interactive map for business of human trafficking stakeholders. So we have also realized there are so many organizations working on this issue, but nobody knows like who is active where, in which area, which are the industries being addressed, which are the regions they are active. So this is going to be the new stakeholder mapping that we call it, which is also going to have a new website. And you can find all this information here on the leaflets that we are having outside. And the stakeholder mapping, you will find it under modernslaverymap.com. And I invite you, of course, to have a look at respect.international or theglobalinitiative.net. And yeah, here you see this. And how you can engage, you can have a look at the website. And I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ms. Wagner, for your presentation and for your convincing argument regarding the need to engage private sector in the fight against human trafficking. And not only for arguments, but for presentation and examples how it could be done in the most efficient, most efficient way. And I mean that Respect Initiative is could be and should be very useful tool and very useful example for and serve as a model for many countries in the world. And I wish you all success in the development of this initiative, in developing international cooperation under the umbrella of this initiative. I thank you very much. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to open the floor to continue with questions, comments, brief observations. You might have the issues and the questions, specific question to the panelists. The floor will be open to the discussion, any issues you have. And I would like to remind you that already we have, about the time constraint, already we have 9 speakers in the list and 25 minutes to finish our panel. And so I kindly ask you to limit your intervention to 3 minutes, not more, and make your presentation as short as possible. And so the first speaker in my list is a representative of Spain. You have the floor.
Muy buenos días a todos.
Good afternoon to everyone. I am a commissioner of the National Police in Spain, and I am in charge of the Central Brigade in fighting trafficking in human beings. We are the central authority within the police in Spain in fighting against this scourge of modern-day slavery. I'd like to give the floor now to one of our best specialists in Spain with respect to investigations into trafficking. We work closely with the Prosecutor General, but there is something that I wanted to mention that I think is quite relevant here regarding this scourge. First of all, let me say that in Spain, the national police focuses specifically on protection and assistance, protection of and assistance to victims. What we do is we try to bring together specialists and various actors who can help victims. I refer to investigators, to police themselves, who are spread out across Spanish territory. It's very important for us to provide training for all of the specialists working within the police force as well. Now, the gender of the person trafficked does play a role, and we try to make sure that the first contact with this person takes place on the part of a police man or woman who is of the same gender as the person trafficked. It's very important for us to ensure the closest possible cooperation with NGOs as well, without which it would be very difficult for us to carry out our work of providing assistance to victims. Another very important matter when we are countering traffic in human beings is fighting against organized crime. Now, clearly, those involved in organized crime are not at all concerned with the dignity of victims of trafficking in human beings. So it's vital that we fight against organized crime in order to be able to stem or defeat this scourge, and international coordination and cooperation is vital here as well. I'd also like to emphasize the importance of providing direct access to justice. I'm going to give the floor to a colleague now, but let me say that coordination among all actors in this area is important. So I'd now like to give the floor to a prosecutor, one of the most experienced specialists in Spain in this area.
OSCE for the opportunity I've been given to briefly introduce my conference paper. My name is Carlos López Veraza. I work as a public prosecutor in Huelva, a city of south of Spain. Identifying and prosecuting trafficking in human beings is often very difficult because of the fear of the victims to testify. For I'm going to inform you about the conference paper that I prepared for this occasion. It is fundamental that there is a cooperation among states and at all levels. However, we usually forget the major role that legal persons can play in the fight against human trafficking being. According, for instance, to a report elaborated by Halt Business International School, 77% of the companies think that there are credible reasons to believe that any kind of modern slavery occurs in their supply chains. Therefore, we should make aware the companies of the necessity of being involved in the fight against human trafficking. I address in the conference paper the backgrounds of the company's criminal liability. Traditionally, there has been some opposition, some reluctance to attribute to the companies any kind of liability for the crimes committed by their managers or by their directors. However, there is usually a worldwide trend to corporate liability. For instance, according to Article 10 of the United Nations Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, it is an obligation for each member of the United Nations Convention to adopt the international to the corporation liability. In the same line, it may be this liability may be civil, administrative, or criminal, but in every case, it must be effective, dissuasive, and proportionate. In the same vein, both the Council at an European level, both.
Colleagues,
I'm going to be a limitation of time.
5 minutes.
Okay, excuse me.
Everybody.
Yes, okay. Then there are the legal instruments. I address the Legal Council for European Convention, also the Directive 2036, the Modern Slavery Act, the California Act, and I describe which companies are main at risk, differentiating stemming from the United Nations definition. I differentiate between the recruitment, the transition, and the exploitation. I give several proposals or suggestions with regard to each company. For instance, with the companies that operate on the internet or with the transport companies, there are several initiatives. For instance, in the United States, the Trackers Against Trafficking. And with regard to the exploitation, I also analyzed some studies, as for instance, the NGO Verity were found that to be most likely to have a risk of 11 questions. And by concluding, I would like also to say that this fight must involve several actors, and we could not forget the major role that legal persons can play. I personally think, and I'm really that in many countries in the next years, there will be companies that will be prosecuted for indirectly fostering cases of trafficking in human beings. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. And before giving the floor to the next speaker, I would like to inform your colleagues that we will finish at 12:35 sharp. And I kindly ask the speakers who will not have possibility to speak during these 20 minutes to make your statement in the afternoon. We have time for lunch break, which start at 12:30, 12:35, and also we have a number of side events during the lunchtime. And let's save time for our colleagues who are working hard and will planning to work hard this afternoon. And so the next speaker in my list is representative of Belgium. You have the floor, please, and please limit your intervention to 3 minutes sharp. Thank you.
Merci, Madame la Modératrice.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. First of all, I would like to thank the Special Representative and team for organising this 18th Alliance meeting. And I'd also like to thank the various people who have spoken to us and have enriched our understanding and contributed to our ideas about projects we could put in place. I'm thinking about how I can react effectively. I want to focus on 2 things. So we just had a presentation on cooperation with the medical sector, and I found that so very important. In Belgium, we have already had campaigns in various hospitals, especially with regard to gynecological provision, A&E, social services in hospitals, and indeed, we have regular referrals from these services, but we also need to pay attention to local actors, including NGOs, in these awareness-raising campaigns, because they are the ones who train on the ground the medical personnel in how to identify or refer presumed victims. Secondly, I'd like to briefly respond to what was said by Mr. McKillop in the first part of this workshop or session. He asked a couple of questions. We are ourselves in the process of putting together a list of indicators in consultation with our financial investigation unit, the Prosecutor General and the Department of Finances. I think that this is particularly important and interesting, particularly because when we've held consultations with the banking sector, they have shown themselves to be very interested in having more information. They want to engage. And so it's useful to look at the financial flows related to THB. As for problems that we've faced in our working group, it's always the issue of specifying these indicators for human trafficking. Very often we have discussions which lead to somebody saying, yes, that's a general indicator of money laundering. So my question to Mr. McKillop is this: how can we specify these indicators so that they are tailored to our needs? And one final reflection about our work today. We also need to insist on evaluating policies, including by national rapporteurs. In Belgium, we have independent national rapporteurs, but state and government agencies also need to do this. Governments need to carry out evaluation and need to work together with the various agencies to ensure that policies are implemented. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I would like to provide opportunity for Mr. McKillop to answer your question. Please, Mr. McKillop.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the question. A couple of ways to do it. I mean, in Canada, we were somewhat blessed because at FinTrack, we have a very huge database. We have about 250 million transactions in there. And we have both our tactical intelligence side as well as our strategic. What we did in terms of developing the indicators was first looking at a general topology, but then we looked at all the cases that we disclosed over the years to our law enforcement partners in Canada, and we sat down and looked at what were the common denominators, the common indicators across a multitude of intelligence disclosures that we made. We took those and we brought them out very specifically to both law enforcement and then to the reporting entities to validate it. So I think depending on how the FIU works in Belgium, there may be a need to sit with the police and with the prosecutors, get access to the cases and look at what were the common denominators and the common indicators across the various cases, what was used by the police as indicators towards the arrest, what was used and presented as evidence, and then from there build the indicators that can then be specified and used for your reporting entities. In Canada, what we did was we did look at the banks. We looked at the type of transactions that they see and the type of transactions where we could provide indicators and red flags for their systems. We then had to modify those and look at different flags or indicators in the money service businesses, for example, where the amount of funds and the type of funds that are being flown through the money services businesses may be slightly different. So there is a need to keep it very specific to the type of entity that you're dealing with, whether it's a bank, credit union, or a money service business, and it has to be based on real cases in your own jurisdiction. You can certainly use the indicators that we provide on our website on the operational alert. It's I think, a very good basis from which to build, and then to see if you're seeing similar patterns of transactions and patterns of criminality in your own jurisdiction.
Thank you very much, Mr. McKillop. And next speaker in my list is representative of Ukraine.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairperson. Good day to all. I'm Oksana Filipishna. I represent the Ombudsman's Office of the Parliament of Ukraine on countering trafficking in human beings, ensuring gender equality, and ensuring children's rights. Let me thank you for the invitation to speak at this annual event. In Ukraine, according to the International Migration Organization, in 2017, there were more than 14,000 people suffering from THB or other forms of exploitation. Trafficking in human beings from Ukraine takes place in countries such as Russia, Moldova, and others. There are a very high number of victims known to the Minister of Social Policy of Ukraine, which acts as a coordinator in countering trafficking in human beings. Currently, the difficult economic situation, the high level of unemployment, and a lack of understanding of migration policy and a lack of awareness on the part of the population about this scourge, as well as the conflict taking place in Ukraine, are factors in trafficking in human beings. Let me note that our government has a number of instruments to counter trafficking in human beings. In 2016, a series of laws were adopted towards this end. We ratified the Convention of the Council of Europe on countering THB and adopted the corresponding laws, as well as issued a number of decrees fighting this scourge and providing material assistance to victims. There are also a number of events that have been organized to promote countering THB, as well as integrating victims of THB. And these are financed by the Ukrainian government. Now, it has been recalled many times during this conference the importance of coordination between all of the various actors, whether these be police, investigators, prosecutors, the government, and civil society organizations. Nevertheless, the monitoring of the situation for human rights in a country regarding specifically THB is something which requires the trust of our citizens. And in Ukraine, it is the prosecutor's office that coordinates these efforts. Let me note that the existing mechanism to counter THB is something that must continue to coordinate with other human rights mechanisms. I would also like to note that adopting a code of conduct that would provide for respective basic principles of human rights would be useful in this effort. Thank you. Thank you very much, Oksana.
Your recommendation, first of all, and I do believe it will be very useful. Involvement of the human rights mechanism into the counter-trafficking efforts nationally, as well as work with the business community in countering trafficking in persons. The next speaker in my list is NGO from Finland, Victim Support. You have the floor. 3 minutes, please.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm speaking on behalf of Victim Support Finland and my colleague here from Monica Multicultural Women's Association, but also our partner organizations, Finnish Refugee Advice Center and Pro-Tukipiste, who couldn't be here today. Multi-sector cooperation between authorities and NGOs is extremely important in order for anti-trafficking measures to be effective, but it's also important that we as civil society actors cooperate between ourselves. Too often, different organizations compete against each other, whereas our experience shows that the best results can be achieved if we actively cooperate and jointly mobilize our resources and expertise to benefit victims of trafficking. In Finland, our 4 NGOs have cooperated for many years, but 3 years ago, we started the so-called 4 Clever Alliance in order to intensify our joint activities. We all work with a slightly different focus and are specialized in different groups of victims and different aspects of victim identification and assistance. Joining this expertise together makes us able to both better assist victims and to better advocate for their rights. For example, we regularly write joint expert statements, and together our voice is stronger than if we would all speak separately. Currently, we jointly collect data on human trafficking victims that we identify in our organizations. This enables us to monitor how many of those victims that are identified by NGOs are ready to seek official assistance and how many are too afraid to contact authorities and only receive assistance from NGOs and hence do not show in official statistics. We also refer client between our organizations, and as we meet regularly and we know each other well, we know when another partner organization has the expertise or capacity to assist our client. This pooling of expertise and resources is particularly important when victims do not receive official government assistance and rely completely on our organizations for help. In some aspects, our work does not overlap, and we don't always agree on everything. But getting to know each other and developing a mutual trust, we have realized that more often we do than don't. Based on our experience, we find this vertical cooperation between CSOs as important as our cooperation with authorities. Thank you for being able to share our experience, and we look forward to hearing experiences in this respect from other countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Your presentation, very good, show us how important is involvement of the civil society into the countering trafficking in persons at the national level. The next speaker in my list is representative of Ukrainian NGO, Suchasnik Plus. Please, you have the floor.
Ваше превосходительство.
Your Excellency, Ms. Businova, and members of the Alliance, I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to speak here and exchange experience. I've been working for more than 20 years in human trafficking, and I saw the conception of the national mechanism, which is financed by the OSCE, project coordinator in OSCE, and I'd like to thank you for that opportunity. We've got a fairly solid model, and we're helping to spread that throughout Ukraine now. But of course, we can't do this in areas that aren't under Ukrainian control. If we look at the national mechanism, then I have to say that everything needs to be anchored in legislation. Thanks to the fact that we have legislation, this was mentioned today, that means that the various stakeholders and autonomous administrations have been involved. So even in a decentralized system, we are able to operate together. We have various local regions and districts involved. Some of these are municipalities. Some of the new heads of regions, when we ask them, what do you think is the most important resource that you have, unfortunately responded that they valued land or money. They didn't talk about their human resources. So today, thanks to the project that's financed by the OSCE project coordinator in Ukraine, we're able to work together with them and develop new strategies where it's not just economic questions that are addressed, but also questions of protecting people when it comes to trafficking in human beings. This is a very important experience for us, and we'd like to continue it because this is just the start. We are sitting around the negotiating table, and we are sharing our ideas about future opportunities for cooperation and how we'll be able to work together with the heads of these local regions. We have a very important role which has developed over the last 20 years. Thank you again for this opportunity to share experience.
Thank you very much, and congratulations that Ukraine started so crucial process of cooperation between NGOs and municipal authorities, municipality. I believe that it could be the very important, crucial factor of protecting victims of human trafficking on the ground. I thank you. Next speaker in my list is representative of the United States of America. Please, you have the floor, and please limit your statement with 3 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. My name is Allison Hollabaugh Parker, and I have the privilege of serving as counsel to the OSCE Parliamentary Assembly Special Representative on Human Trafficking, Representative Christopher Smith from the United States Congress. And the Parliamentary Assembly and the Ministerial Council are in agreement, strong agreement, that it's critical we increase international law enforcement cooperation to prevent harms to children and sex trafficking and other forms of sexual exploitation, particularly by perpetrators traveling transnationally for sex tourism. Similar to the Parliamentary Assembly Tbilisi resolution in 2016, the Ministerial Council in December, just last year, adopted a comprehensive decision, Decision 717, which was calling on participating states to focus on known perpetrators who may be traveling for sex tourism, registering their names and sharing information among law enforcement and judicial authorities to prevent future exploitation. Traveling perpetrators rely on secrecy and anonymity to commit crimes against children. Registries that are built domestically within each of our participating states and then shared when a perpetrator is traveling to another destination country, either inside or outside the OSCE region, is critical to ensuring that the countries are aware and able to protect themselves from individuals who have a history of harming children. The United States set up a program of this nature over the last several years. It's called the Angel Watch program, created through the International Megan's Law. And over the last few years, the Angel Watch program has warned more than 100 destination countries of more than 3,600 sex offenders with previous offenses against children seeking entry into countries across the world, including the OSCE region. In February, just 2 months ago, an individual convicted in 2011 for sexual exploitation of a child and child pornography conviction in the United States attempted to travel to a participating state. The U.S. sent advance notification to that state, which decided to conduct a border inspection of the perpetrator when he arrived. The border inspection found child pornography on his electronic devices. The state also discovered that the individual was traveling to work as a cheerleading and gymnastics instructor for children in that state. The individual was deported and then arrested as soon as he returned to the United States. This story underscores that child sex trafficking and exploitation in tourism is not just an issue with countries outside the OSCE region. OSCE countries are both sending states and destination states for traveling perpetrators. We invite participating states to partner with the U.S. in keeping those who have sexually abused children and keeping registries of individuals who have sexually abused children, and then sending notifications when the perpetrators are traveling to the United States or to other OSCE countries. Again, these were included in both the ministerial decision and the parliamentary decision in Tbilisi. We can prevent child sex trafficking and exploitation in travel and tourism through law enforcement coordination. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You are totally right that adequate addressing to the tourism for sex trafficking, for addressing to sex tourism as well as countering child pornography is very important area for bilateral and international cooperation for countering human trafficking in general. And dear colleagues, I just would like to provide the floor to the last speaker in my list, representative of Finland. Other speakers from Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Holy See will have opportunity to address to the audience in the second part of the day. And so the floor is yours, representative of Finland, please.
Thank you, moderator. I'd like to thank the special representative for organizing this event and the panelists for their inspiring presentations. We absolutely need the kind of new solutions that have been shared today. We should always keep asking, what else should we do? With who else? In what ways? Finland works to counter trafficking in human beings home and abroad. Today, I'd like to share some of Finland's experiences regarding partnerships at home. Finland considers trafficking in human beings a grave human rights violation that demands action. This must be a shared effort. We need new partnerships with and within the civil society and private sector, but also with professionals from different walks of life. One thing we have been looking at lately is how to better find the victims. We tend to recognize victims well in some sectors, but not in others. For example, we have noticed that victims pass through healthcare system largely unnoticed. Therefore, government, health professionals, and IOM have partnered up. Recently, they provided a concrete toolkit for health practitioners to spot and help victims. Businesses, too, need to be part of the effort. Just yesterday, the European Institute for Crime Prevention and Control, which is a Helsinki-based research institution, published a handbook for Finnish businesses on how to spot and how to prevent labor exploitation in subcontracting and supply chains. This means safeguard mechanism, checklists, and red flags. Businesses, organizations, and the government are part of the project. But making nurses, doctors, and CEOs part of the effort is just the start. These partnerships need to be taken much further. Last, I would like to bring up partnerships with NGOs. These are partnerships through financing, constant dialogue, and doing together. NGOs play an absolutely central role in Finland, providing shelter and support to those victims who are unwilling or unable to contact authorities for help. But they also advocate, train, and give expert opinion to the governments and lawmakers. Thank you for this opportunity to speak. We already have a lot to take home from this conference, and we're looking forward to the last panel in the afternoon.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, dear colleagues. And so we finished our session, and for brief wrap-up, I'll just would like to thank, in conclusion, all the speakers for their great contribution. I would like to compliment all of them for interesting insights, thought-provoking ideas, and forward-looking initiatives. I would also like to thank the audience for your response to their discussion, and intervention from speakers have confirmed that building new partnership is a must when speaking about efficient strategies to combat human trafficking. And I encourage all of you that upon return to your countries to have a focused discussion with your colleagues from national authorities on the very important issue, how parliaments, local authorities, survivors, financial sectors, healthcare professionals, and businesses could be better engaged in the fight against human trafficking. I would like also to encourage the OSCE to follow up on these initiatives and develop concrete projects which could have impact on the practical day-to-day works. To show that we really care, we have to act. We have to act together. Thank you again, and enjoy your lunch and side events.
I would like to thank our moderator, Larysa, for this good management of our long panel, and also join to her thanking all our panelists.